Osborne. I work in membership services for Women's Aid Federation, which is the lead voluntary agency in Northern Ireland addressing domestic abuse. One of my main roles in my job is to cover policy and lobbying. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I use human rights documents in my everyday work. So the first way that I use human rights documents is just very basically to frame domestic abuse as a gendered issue and as a form of violence against women and girls, which seems quite simplistic, but in Northern Ireland we operate in a gender neutral policy environment, which means that all of our legislation, and quite rightly, is there, and it's gender neutral and it's to protect all victims, but we have no way of talking about domestic abuse as it pertains to women directly, because it disproportionately impacts on them. Recent police stats suggest that 69% of all victims are female and 86% of perpetrators are men. So there are very clear gendered breakdowns of how this impacts differently on men and women. General Recommendation 35 of CEDAW is particularly useful in framing domestic abuse as an equality issue. It impacts on women because they experience inequality in respect to their male counterparts, and that affects their ability to enjoy rights on an equal basis. So being able to use that recommendation to really kind of give evidence to the fact that this is a gendered issue and a form of gender-based violence is really useful. The Istanbul Convention, which is the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, is a really useful document in doing that also. The UK signed the Istanbul Convention in 2012. We have not yet ratified it. But that as a way to really kind of emphasize that this is a gendered form of gender-based violence is really useful. The way that I would use that in my everyday job is if I'm talking about child contact, for example, the Istanbul Convention is the only international human rights document that really kind of specifies that child contact should be safe and shouldn't be applied where a partner has been, or sorry, a parent has been abusive. So, for example, it says parties shall take all necessary legislative and other measures to ensure that the exercise of any visitation or custody rights does not jeopardise the rights and safety of the victim or their children. And that's really very explicit. So I use that quite a lot. It also makes recommendations about media guidance, or not recommendations, sorry, obligations. That media guidance, that the media should not, without jeopardizing the integrity and the independence of the media, should really take care not to frame domestic abuse as a victim's fault, and not perpetrate those re-emphasize those kind of victim blaming myths that we have. It also, most importantly, calls for gender sensitive policy making, which is really useful in Northern Ireland because we don't do that. So the Istanbul Convention calls for gender sensitive strategies and policies and legislation that calls domestic abuse what it is, which is a form of gender-based violence. Northern Ireland remains the only part of the United Kingdom without a violence against women and girls strategy, which does not meet our obligations under the Istanbul Convention at all. Other kind of frameworks that I use, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls has been incredibly useful, particularly through COVID. The office has really kind of stepped up its monitoring because COVID has exacerbated domestic abuse so profoundly. So since March, I've responded to 2 consultations for the Special Rapporteur's office, one on sort of general domestic abuse rates in Northern Ireland, and then one specifically on femicide, which is incredibly important in Northern Ireland because since March 2020, we have had 5 women murdered by a male partner or relative, which is a shocking statistic anyway, but when you compare it to the entirety of 2018-2019, that financial year, we only had 4 women murdered in the whole year, and we managed to beat that in 5 months, which is horrific. So things like that are incredibly useful just to shine a light on what's really happening in terms of domestic abuse, and as a result, we're seeing an increase in murders, and that we don't have a femicide census in Northern Ireland, for example. We have absolutely no mechanisms to monitor male violence against women that results in a murder. Now there is something in England that kind of includes women from Northern Ireland, but it's not specific, and it would be really good to have that here. So responding to consultations like that is a really useful way to kind of shine a light on that, and make sure also that international bodies are paying attention. Another mechanism that I've used recently is the International Labour Organization 190, which is a recommendation on violence and harassment in the workplace. It specifically mentions domestic abuse and the impact that that can have on victims and survivors at work. And that's been really useful to lobby around paid leave, for example, for women or just victims in general who have experienced domestic violence and have to take time off work, be that for doctor's appointments or to move house, or for court appearances is a big one. So that would be how I would use that. The thing that I use most often in my work is that CEDAW's concluding observations. So they came out in 2019, and basically they mention Northern Ireland so frequently that it's impossible not to use them. They are 9 times out of 10, they have something that's incredibly useful that I can use. And so some examples of that would be the commissioning of services for specialist services for domestic abuse. For example, it talks quite emphatically about making sure that things like austerity and welfare reform don't impact on the provision of services for women, which they did, and we have not rectified that yet. So whenever we're talking about the allocation of funding, the concluding observations are really useful to be able to point to that and say, well, they talk about tendering processes and they talk about gender neutral services not being useful for women and or men for that matter, and it's a really useful tool to kind of shine a light on that and explain why we're asking for specialist services and specialist provisions for gender-based violence. Universal credit is another one that the concluding observations are very useful to use. Basically, universal credit has disproportionately impacted on women generally, but it's had very specific implications for women who have experienced domestic abuse. So the two-child tax credit limit, for example, penalizes women because it assumes that all women have control over their own reproduction, which is not the case when women are in abusive relationships, unfortunately. CEDAW makes recommendations that the two-child cap should be lifted and that the rape clause should be abolished, and that in general welfare reform needs to be reviewed because it's not working for women, particularly women who are in violent situations. It also talks about legal aid, which has been very useful recently because in Northern Ireland we're discussing extending legal aid to victims who don't quite meet the threshold but who are being dragged through the courts, and the courts are being used by their abusive ex-partners to re-victimize them and financially abuse them because they potentially are getting legal aid and their victims are not. And so they're able to skip court or continuously have to go back to court in order to rack up solicitors' costs and fees that then burden their victims. So there's a conversation around that at the minute, and potentially having that put into our domestic abuse legislation, which would mean then that women who are on the cusp of qualifying for legal aid do. And certainly that's something that CEDAW made a point of mentioning a year ago. So that's another really kind of useful way that those concluding observations can be used to advocate in my role.